A racist cop pulls over a man late at night, treating him with hostility and disdain. He accuses him of being a gang member, drags him out of his car and locks him in a holding cell, all without knowing the truth. This man is a respected judge with the power to destroy everything the cop has built. But when the cop realizes who he's dealing with, it's already too late. His dark secrets begin to unravel, revealing a dangerous web of corruption and lies. How far will this cop go to protect his empire, and can the judge survive long enough to expose the truth? This is a story of power, justice, and the fight to take down a corrupt system. Don't miss it. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Rafael Ortiz stood at the polished wooden podium, his fingers absently brushing against the worn face of his father's vintage watch. The grand hotel ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and elegant table settings, filled with the city's most influential legal minds. But Rafael's thoughts drifted to simpler times, to the modest kitchen table where his father had taught him about justice and dignity over steaming cups of coffee. "When I was 10 years old," Rafael began, his voice steady and warm, "my father came home from the factory with grease-stained hands and a troubled look in his eyes. One of his co-workers had been injured but was too afraid to report it, fearing deportation." He paused, making eye contact with various faces in the crowd. "That night, my father taught me that justice isn't just a concept in law books. It's about standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves." The crowd leaned in, captivated by the personal story. Rafael's hand returned to his father's watch, drawing strength from the familiar texture of its worn leather strap. "That's why organizations like the Legal Aid Society are so vital," he continued. "They ensure that justice isn't a luxury reserved for those who can afford it, but a right accessible to all." His voice carried throughout the ballroom, touching every corner with its sincerity. As he concluded his speech, the room erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, their enthusiasm genuine and heartfelt. Rafael smiled, humbled by the response, and made his way back to his table. "Another home run, Your Honor," Maria Delgado, his clerk, teased as he sat down. "Though I think you broke your personal record for most metaphors in one speech." Rafael chuckled. "My father always said if you can't paint a picture with your words, you might as well be talking to yourself." Judge Thompson, a veteran of the bench, leaned across the table. "Powerful words, Rafael. We need more voices like yours, especially with all these corruption allegations floating around the precincts lately." His expression darkened. 3 investigations this month alone. Rafael frowned, but before he could probe further, his phone buzzed. The screen showed a message from his sister about their mother's medication schedule for tomorrow. "I hate to leave early," he said, standing and straightening his navy suit jacket, "but I promised to visit Mama in the morning. She's having good days and bad days lately." Maria nodded understandingly. "Give her my love, and try to get some rest. You look tired." The drive home took Rafael through winding rural roads, away from the city's glare. The night was clear and quiet, broken only by his soft humming, an old Mexican folk song his father used to sing while working in the garage. The memory brought both warmth and melancholy to his heart. Lost in thought, he almost missed the sudden flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. The patrol car had appeared seemingly out of nowhere on the empty highway. "What now?" Rafael muttered, carefully steering his car onto the shoulder and switching off the radio. He watched in his side mirror as the police cruiser came to a stop behind him, its lights painting the darkness in alternating colors. The harsh beam of light pierced through Rafael's driver's side window, momentarily blinding him. He squinted and raised his hand slightly, trying to shield his eyes from the intense glare. Heavy footsteps crunched on the gravel as Officer Don Keller approached, his imposing figure casting a long shadow in the darkness. "License and registration," Keller barked, not bothering with any greeting. His flashlight remained fixed on Rafael's face, the beam unwavering and intentionally uncomfortable. "Of course, officer," Rafael replied calmly, reaching slowly for his wallet. His fingers brushed against his father's watch as he retrieved his license. The familiar touch steadied his nerves as he carefully pulled his registration from the glove compartment. Keller snatched the documents from Rafael's outstretched hand. The officer's eyes narrowed as he studied the license, his gaze darting between the photo and Raphael's face with obvious skepticism. "This your car?" Keller asked, his tone dripping with suspicion. He swept his flashlight across the luxury vehicle's interior. "Yes, sir," Raphael answered. "Is there a problem?" "Pretty nice ride for someone like you," Keller sneered. "Where'd you get it?" Raphael took a deep breath, maintaining his composure. "It was a gift from my father before he passed away." A dismissive smirk crossed Keller's face. "Right. And I suppose you just happened to be wearing that fancy suit for fun?" He leaned closer to the window, his badge catching the moonlight. "Which gang you running with, huh? Must be doing well to afford all this." "Officer, I'm not in any gang," Raphael stated firmly but politely. "I was actually just leaving a charity gala." "Step out of the vehicle," Keller interrupted, his hand moving to rest on his holster. "Now." Raphael's heart pounded, but his voice remained steady. "May I ask why I was pulled over, officer?" Instead of answering, Keller yanked open the driver's door. "You people always think you're above the law, don't you? Think that fancy car and suit make you special?" He began roughly searching through the car's interior without permission. "Officer Keller," Raphael said, reading the nameplate on the uniform. "I have the right to know." "Shut it!" Keller growled, grabbing Raphael's arm and dragging him from the car. "You want to play lawyer with me? How about we add resisting arrest to the charges?" Before Raphael could protest, Keller slammed him against the hood of his car. The cold metal pressed against his cheek as the officer roughly handcuffed his wrists behind his back. "I'm not resisting," Raphael said clearly, fighting to keep his voice calm despite the shock and humiliation of the situation. The metal of his father's watch dug painfully into his wrist beneath the tight handcuffs. Keller reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 247. I need backup on Highway 23, mile marker 42. Got a possible drug runner here giving me trouble." Raphael closed his eyes, his father's lessons about dignity echoing in his mind as he lay pressed against the hood of his car, the night air growing colder around him. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Officer Keller roughly pushed Raphael through the station's double doors, his fingers digging painfully into Raphael's shoulder. The harsh lighting cast sickly shadows across the worn linoleum floor, making the already dreary space feel even more oppressive. Several officers looked up from their desks, their expressions a mix of curiosity and deliberate indifference, some quickly averting their eyes when Raphael tried to make eye contact. "Got ourselves a troublemaker," Keller announced, shoving Raphael toward the booking desk with unnecessary force. "This one thinks he's too good to follow simple instructions, thinks the rules don't apply to him." Raphael maintained his composure as Keller began the booking process, though his heart ached when the officer roughly yanked his father's watch from his wrist, the metal clasp scraping against his skin. The vintage timepiece clinked against the plastic evidence bag as Keller carelessly tossed it aside, the sound making Raphael wince internally. "I have the right to make a phone call," Raphael stated evenly, keeping his voice steady despite his rising anger. "And I'd like to know the specific charges against me." Keller laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the station like broken glass. "Resisting arrest for starters. Should have seen how he tried to fight me during the traffic stop." He turned to his colleagues, embellishing the story with theatrical gestures. "Almost took a swing at me when I asked him to step out of the vehicle. Real piece of work, this one." Raphael noticed a young officer in the corner shift uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Keller and the floor like a nervous bird. The junior officer's badge read, "Martinez," and his body language screamed discomfort with the situation, his fingers fidgeting with his notepad. But like the others, he remained silent, trapped in the web of complicity. After being fingerprinted and photographed like a common criminal, Raphael found himself locked in a holding cell. The metal bench was cold beneath him, and the flickering lights cast strange shadows through the bars, dancing across the graffiti-marked walls. Keller approached the cell, twirling Raphael's car keys around his finger with smug satisfaction. "Not so high and mighty now, are you?" he sneered, his breath smelling of stale coffee. "You're nobody here, just another troublemaker who needs to learn his place in the world." Raphael stood slowly, his shoulders straight and dignified despite his circumstances. The cell's cold metal bars pressed against his back as he met Keller's gaze steadily, his voice clear and unwavering as he spoke the words that would change everything. "I'm Judge Rafael Ortiz. You just made the biggest mistake of your career." The effect was immediate. The station fell silent, save for the endless buzz of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of a phone ringing unanswered. Keller's face went slack with shock, then hardened into something more calculated and dangerous. Without a word, he turned to the computer terminal and began rapidly typing, his fingers stabbing at the keys as he deleted all traces of Rafael's arrest. Then, without looking back, he strode out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, leaving behind a wake of tense silence that seemed to suffocate everyone present. The holding cell was barely big enough for two people, with a metal bench bolted to the wall and a small window near the ceiling that let in a sliver of moonlight. The air was stale and carried the sharp scent of industrial cleaner. Rafael sat quietly, his back straight against the cold concrete wall, watching Officer Keller pace back and forth outside. The officer's boots squeaked against the floor as he barked orders at his subordinates, his voice carrying an edge of panic that made his commands even more aggressive. "Make sure those arrest records are completely gone," Keller snapped at a junior officer, jabbing his finger in the air for emphasis. "And get me everything we have on Judge Ortiz. Every single file, you understand?" Rafael carefully observed the station's layout through the cell bars, his trained eye taking in every detail. 2 exits, the main entrance with its heavy security door and what appeared to be a back door near the break room where officers gathered for coffee. 4 officers on duty, excluding Keller, all of them looking tense and avoiding eye contact with the cells. Security cameras in the corners, though one seemed to be broken, its red light dark and lifeless. A quiet sniffle drew Rafael's attention to the cell's other occupant, a young man huddled in the corner, his shoulders trembling slightly as he tried to make himself as small as possible. "Are you all right?" Rafael asked softly, keeping his tone gentle and non-threatening. The young man looked up, revealing red-rimmed eyes and a bruised cheek that had started to turn purple. "I'm Lucas Ramirez," he whispered, his voice shaking like autumn leaves in the wind. "I'm Rafael. Can you tell me why you're here, Lucas?" Lucas glanced nervously at Keller's retreating figure before speaking, his words coming out in hushed bursts. "They said they found drugs in my car, but it's not true. Officer Keller." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "He came to my brother's shop last week asking for protection money. When we couldn't pay, he said we'd regret it. He smiled when he said it. That's what scared me the most." Rafael leaned forward, keeping his voice low and gentle. "Has this happened to others?" "Everyone knows about Keller in this precinct," Lucas continued, gaining confidence as Rafael listened intently. His words came faster now, like a dam breaking. "They target people who can't fight back, immigrants, small business owners, anyone vulnerable. If you can't pay their bribes, they find ways to arrest you or worse. Some people just disappear for a while." As Lucas spoke, Rafael noticed how he flinched every time an officer passed by, his whole body tensing like a startled animal. The young man's hands were clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white with tension, fingers fidgeting with a small silver medallion. "My family saved for years to open that shop," Lucas said, his voice breaking with emotion. "We worked so hard, now everything's ruined because we couldn't pay them off. My mother's heart will break when she finds out." Keller strode past their cell again, keys jangling at his belt like a warning bell. Lucas immediately fell silent, shrinking back into the shadows as if trying to melt into the wall. Rafael watched the officer carefully, noting the swagger in his step, the casual way he touched his weapon. All signs of a man who believed himself untouchable, who had never faced consequences for his actions. In that moment, studying Keller's arrogant demeanor, Rafael made a silent promise to himself and to Lucas. This wasn't over. Justice would find its way into these dark corners, no matter the cost. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered on at dawn, jolting Rafael awake with their unforgiving glare. His neck ached fiercely from sleeping on the hard metal bench, and his usually crisp navy suit was hopelessly wrinkled from the uncomfortable night. As he stretched his stiff muscles trying to work out the knots that had formed, he caught sight of Officer Keller standing outside the cell, a self-satisfied smirk playing across his weathered face. Lucas, who had barely slept a wink during the long night, pressed himself tightly against the far wall as Keller unlocked the cell door and strode in with deliberate steps. The officer's badge gleamed menacingly under the harsh lighting as he positioned himself directly in front of Raphael, invading his personal space with calculated intimidation. "You think being a judge makes you untouchable?" Keller's voice was low and gravelly, dripping with menace. "Around here, nobody's above the law. My law. Remember that." Raphael met Keller's gaze steadily, refusing to flinch or show any sign of weakness. The officer's breath smelled of stale coffee and cigarettes as he leaned in closer, trying to provoke a reaction. "You know what I've learned in my years on the force?" Keller circled Raphael like a predator stalking its prey, his boots clicking against the concrete floor. "Everyone's got secrets, especially judges. Those fancy robes hide all sorts of skeletons in the closet. Would be a shame if some of yours came to light, wouldn't it?" Raphael remained perfectly still, his expression carefully neutral. He noticed a slight tremor in Keller's hands, a telltale bead of sweat on his temple despite the cell's coolness. The officer's bravado couldn't completely mask his underlying unease, and Raphael could sense it. "You're nervous," Raphael said quietly, his words cutting through Keller's threats like a knife through butter. "You're worried I might know something that could ruin you. That's what this is really about." Keller's face twitched violently, his mask of confidence slipping for just a moment. His eyes widened slightly, and his jaw clenched so tight that a muscle jumped in his cheek. Then, like a switch being flipped, his arrogant demeanor returned full force. He grabbed Raphael's collar roughly, pulling him close enough that their faces nearly touched. "Stay quiet," he hissed through clenched teeth, "or you won't leave here alive. That's not a threat. It's a promise." Keller released Raphael with a forceful shove and stormed out of the cell, his anger evident in every step. The door slammed shut with a metallic clang that echoed ominously through the block. Raphael straightened his collar with steady hands, his calm demeanor unchanged by the violent encounter. He turned to Lucas, who still huddled fearfully in the corner, his young face pale with worry. "This isn't about me anymore," Raphael said softly, his voice gentle but determined. "There's something bigger at play here, and we need to figure out what it is." In the dim light of their shared cell, Lucas shifted nervously on the metal bench across from Raphael. His eyes darted toward the corridor where officers occasionally passed by, their footsteps echoing against the concrete floors like ominous drumbeats in the stillness. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows on the grimy walls. "They can't hear us if we speak quietly," Raphael assured him in a gentle voice, leaning forward slightly to create a more intimate space between them. "Tell me what happened, Lucas. How did you end up here?" Lucas wrung his hands until his knuckles turned white, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was because of my brother, Miguel. Officer Keller tried to shake him down for money last month, said he'd make some parking tickets disappear." His shoulders tensed and he hunched forward as if trying to make himself smaller. But Miguel refused to pay. He said it wasn't right. Raphael nodded encouragingly, noting how Lucas's eyes welled with tears. The young man's distress was palpable, radiating off him in waves. 3 days later, they arrested me, claimed they found drugs in my backpack during a random search. Lucas wiped his eyes with his sleeve, his hand trembling. "But I've never touched drugs in my life, sir. Never. The evidence was planted. My mama raised us better than that." "Does this happen often here?" Raphael asked, keeping his voice low and steady, his eyes fixed on Lucas's face. Lucas glanced around before continuing, his fingers fidgeting with a loose thread on his sleeve. "All the time. It's like they're running a business. Pay up or face charges. Those who can afford it give them money or do favors. The rest of us..." He gestured at their surroundings, the hopelessness in his voice cutting deep. "How deep does it go?" Raphael pressed gently, his heart heavy with each revelation. "Deep." Lucas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "There's this guy, Martinez. He refused to pay last year. They arrested him on fake charges too. But when he threatened to expose them, Lucas's voice trembled and he wrapped his arms around himself. He just disappeared. His family still doesn't know what happened. His little girls ask about him every day. Raphael felt a chill run down his spine as he recalled Keller's earlier threat. The officer's words took on a darker meaning now, like poison slowly seeping through his thoughts. Some judges are in on it too, Lucas added, his voice barely audible, almost lost in the hum of the building's ventilation system. And politicians. That's why nothing changes. Nobody dares to speak up. They've got everybody scared, watching their backs. Raphael processed this information, his mind already forming connections. The corruption wasn't just about petty bribes. It was systematic, organized, protected from above. Like a cancer that had spread through the entire system. Looking at Lucas's frightened face, Raphael placed a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder, feeling him tremble beneath his touch. "We'll get through this together," he said firmly. "You're stronger than you think." Lucas managed a weak smile, but Raphael could see the fear still lingering in his eyes, like shadows refusing to fade in the morning light. Silently, Raphael made a promise to himself. He would protect this young man and bring Keller's corrupt empire crashing down no matter the cost. Someone had to take a stand, and that someone would be him. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Raphael watched Keller through the cell bars. The officer was hunched over his desk, frantically shuffling through paperwork, his coffee cup long forgotten at the edge of the metal surface. His movements were rushed, almost panicked as he signed document after document, occasionally muttering under his breath. Raphael's keen eyes caught something interesting. A name scrawled in the margins of one report. Markson. The handwriting was messy, as if written in haste but clear enough to read. He committed it to memory, sensing its importance in the web of corruption he was uncovering. Turning to Lucas, who sat huddled in the corner of their cell, his knees drawn up to his chest, Raphael kept his voice low. "Does the name Markson mean anything to you?" Lucas's eyes widened with recognition, his fingers nervously picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. He glanced nervously at the corridor before leaning closer, the metal bench creaking beneath him. Officer James Markson. He was one of the good ones, Lucas whispered, his voice trembling slightly. About 3 years ago, he started asking questions about Keller's operation, filed an official complaint about missing evidence and suspicious arrests. He even tried to help some of us who'd been wrongly detained. "What happened to him?" Raphael asked, though he already suspected the answer, his stomach knotting with dread. "Nobody knows for sure." Lucas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "One day, he just vanished. His car was found empty near the highway, engine still running. The official report said he probably left town, but..." He shook his head, shoulders hunching. "Everyone knows Captain Henley and Keller were behind it. They couldn't risk Markson exposing everything." Raphael's jaw tightened as the pieces clicked into place, his fists clenching at his sides. This wasn't just about bribes and false arrests. This was something far more sinister. If Keller and his superiors were willing to eliminate a fellow officer, there was no telling what they might do to protect their operation. Heavy footsteps approached their cell, echoing off the concrete walls. Keller appeared, his face twisted into a menacing smile, keys jangling at his belt. He stood directly in front of Raphael, using his height to try to intimidate him, his breath smelling of stale coffee. "You're smarter than the average detainee," Keller sneered, his eyes cold and calculating. "But smart people don't survive long here." He turned to the guards nearby, who straightened at his attention. "Double the security on this cell. No one talks to them without my permission. No phone calls, no visitors, nothing." The message was clear. Raphael was completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in a system designed to silence those who dared to question it. The morning sun barely penetrated the small window of the holding cell as Raphael sat quietly on the metal bench, his father's watch ticking steadily against his wrist. A metallic clang echoed through the corridor, footsteps approaching. He recognized Keller's heavy stride, followed by another set of footsteps, more measured and deliberate. the kind that commanded attention. Through the air vent above, voices drifted down with surprising clarity. Raphael held up his hand, signaling Lucas to stay silent as he listened intently, his years of courtroom experience helping him focus on every nuance. "Judge Ortiz is dangerous," Keller's voice came through, tinged with anxiety and barely contained anger. "He's been asking questions, and that kid Lucas has been talking to him. He knows too much. The whole operation could be compromised." A cold, authoritative voice responded. "Captain Roger Henley," his words precise and calculated. "Then handle it. Permanently. We didn't come this far to let one judge ruin everything." Raphael's heart pounded against his ribs, but his face remained composed as he absorbed every word, just as he'd done countless times in his courtroom. Lucas huddled closer, his thin frame shaking, eyes wide with fear. "What about the transfer tomorrow?" Keller asked, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Perfect opportunity," Henley replied, his tone emotionless as discussing the weather. "Accidents happen during transfers all the time. Make it look convincing. Mechanical failure, perhaps. Something that can't be traced back to us. You know how these things work." Raphael closed his eyes, concentrating on memorizing every detail of their conversation, his judicial mind cataloging each word. The casual way they discussed his murder sent chills down his spine, but strengthened his resolve. "And the kid?" Keller's voice again, uncertain. "One problem at a time," Henley responded coldly with the finality of someone used to giving orders. "Focus on the judge first. We can't risk everything we've built over one nosy judge who thinks he can play hero. The rest will fall into place." Lucas's hands trembled as he listened, his fingers intertwining nervously. Raphael placed a steady hand on the young man's shoulder, offering silent reassurance while his mind raced with possibilities. The conversation continued, with Henley laying out specific instructions about timing and methodology, each word more damning than the last. Raphael absorbed every detail, his mind already working on potential countermoves, drawing on years of experience fighting corruption from behind the bench. Heavy footsteps signaled the end of their meeting, echoing down the corridor. As Keller passed by the cell, he paused, looking directly at Raphael with a smirk that didn't reach his cold eyes, a silent challenge hanging in the air between them. Raphael waited until Keller was out of earshot before turning to Lucas. "They're planning something," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the gravity of their situation. "We need to be ready. Stay alert and trust no one." Lucas nodded, his face pale but determined, showing a glimpse of the strength Raphael had sensed in him from the start. The morning sun cast harsh shadows through the cell bars, a stark reminder of the dangerous game they were now caught in, and the deadly stakes they faced. The evening shadows lengthened across the holding cell as Raphael lay on the hard bench, his eyes nearly closed but his mind sharp and alert. Through barely opened lids, he watched the officers move about their duties, mentally noting every detail of their patterns. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made the cell feel even more oppressive. "Third shift change," he whispered to Lucas, who sat hunched on the opposite bench, arms wrapped around himself for comfort. "Always at 8 p.m. Officer Martinez takes 15 minutes for his coffee break right after, like clockwork." Lucas leaned forward, his voice barely audible, his dark eyes wide with curiosity. "How do you notice all this stuff? I can barely keep track of time in here." "Sometimes you don't need strength to fight, just strategy," Raphael replied softly, his eyes tracking the movement of keys on Officer Chen's belt as she passed by. The metallic jingle seemed to echo his thoughts. Raphael had already created a mental blueprint of the station's layout. 2 emergency exits flanked the main entrance, their red signs casting a faint glow in the dimness. The security cameras, old models with obvious blind spots, covered the main corridors but left several corners unmonitored. He paid particular attention to Officer Daniels, a young cop who seemed to flinch every time Keller raised his voice. The rookie's nervous energy was almost palpable. Daniels stood at his post, shoulders tense, fingers drumming against his holster, as Keller burst into the cell block. The senior officer's face was flushed with anger as he stormed up to their cell, his heavy footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. "You!" Keller jabbed a finger at Lucas. "Think carefully about what you've been saying to your cellmate. One wrong word, and those drug charges might just multiply. His voice dripped with menace, but Raphael noticed the slight tremor in his hand, the sheen of sweat on his forehead. The man's collar was damp with perspiration. Lucas shrank back against the wall, but Raphael caught the flash of defiance in the young man's eyes before he lowered them. His hands were trembling, but his jaw was set firm. Keller paced the cell block, barking orders at Daniels about increased surveillance. His movements were jerky, his commands contradictory. When Daniels hesitated to respond, Keller snapped, "Are you deaf or just stupid?" His voice cracked slightly on the last word. The young officer's face reddened, but he remained silent, his discomfort evident in every rigid line of his body. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. As Keller stormed out, his footsteps echoing down the corridor like angry thunder, Raphael turned to Lucas. "Every bully makes mistakes when they feel cornered," he whispered, a knowing look in his eyes. "We just need to wait for his, and trust me, he's already showing cracks." The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered overhead as Officer Keller led Raphael into the cramped interrogation room. The space felt deliberately claustrophobic, with its stark white walls showing years of scuff marks and a heavy metal table bolted to the stained floor. Raphael's polished shoes clicked against the worn linoleum as he took his seat, maintaining perfect posture despite his wrinkled suit and the exhaustion weighing on his shoulders. Keller slouched in his chair, a manila folder spread before him, its edges dog-eared and coffee-stained. "So, Judge Ortiz," he drawled, emphasizing the title with mock respect, his fingers drumming an irregular pattern on the folder. "Let's talk about what brought you here." "Of course," Raphael replied smoothly, his voice steady and controlled, just as his father had taught him. "Though I'm curious why you've waited until now for a formal interrogation. 3 days seems rather excessive." Keller's smug smile faltered slightly, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "I ask the questions here. That's how this works." "Do you?" Raphael leaned forward, his hands folded on the table, father's watch gleaming under the harsh lighting. "Because from what I've observed, you seem more interested in intimidation than investigation. That's not typically how professional law enforcement operates." Keller's jaw tightened, a vein pulsing in his temple. "Watch yourself, Judge. Your fancy title doesn't mean anything in here. You're just another suspect in my custody." "Interesting choice of words," Raphael mused, noting every micro-expression crossing Keller's face. "I've been hearing whispers about how things work in this precinct, about Officer Markson, for instance. His sudden departure raised quite a few eyebrows." The color drained from Keller's face before anger flooded in, turning his complexion an ugly shade of red. "Markson isn't your concern anymore," he snapped, his fist hitting the table with enough force to rattle the metal legs. "No?" Raphael maintained his calm demeanor, even as his heart raced with the thrill of confirmation. "A man like you must need powerful friends to operate so freely. I wonder what they'd think if certain details came to light, the kind of details Markson might have known." "You don't know what you're talking about," Keller growled, but his confidence was cracking like thin ice on a spring morning. Sweat beaded on his upper lip. "Don't I? Your reaction suggests otherwise." Raphael's voice remained measured, professional, though inside he was cataloging every tell. "Tell me, Officer Keller, how long can someone like you last without their allies? When the foundation starts to crumble?" Keller stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh screech. "We're done here. You're a dangerous man who doesn't know when to quit. That's going to be a problem." As two officers appeared to escort Raphael back to his cell, their expressions carefully blank, Keller grabbed his arm roughly. His fingers dug into Raphael's bicep like talons. "Keep talking, and you'll regret it. Some accidents can't be prevented." Raphael met his gaze steadily, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He knew he'd struck gold. Markson's disappearance was clearly the key to unraveling everything. Now he just had to stay alive long enough to use it. The evening shadows stretched across the cell floor as Lucas shifted nervously on the metal bench, the cold surface making him fidget even more. His eyes darted toward the corridor, checking for any sign of movement before settling on Raphael. After several moments of internal struggle, during which his hands twisted in his lap. He scooted closer. "Judge Ortiz," Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible above the steady hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. "I've been listening to Keller when he thinks no one can hear. He doesn't pay attention to someone like me." Raphael leaned forward, his expression gentle and encouraging, careful not to make any sudden movements that might startle the anxious young man. "That must have taken courage. More than you know." Lucas shook his head vigorously, hands fidgeting in his lap as he stared at the concrete floor. "I'm scared all the time. Not brave like you. Every footstep makes my heart race." "Being brave isn't about not feeling fear," Raphael said softly, his father's words flowing through him like a warm current. "It's about standing up despite that fear. Every time you choose to do what's right even when you're terrified. That's real courage. I've seen plenty of so-called brave men crack under pressure." Something changed in Lucas's expression, a small spark of determination breaking through his usual anxiety, like sunshine through storm clouds. He straightened his shoulders slightly, lifting his chin just a fraction. "I've heard things," Lucas continued, his voice steadier now. "Keller, he keeps talking about this logbook. Yesterday he was yelling at one of the new officers about it, telling him to hide it where no one will find it. He was really worked up about it." Raphael's interest peaked, his mind already racing with possibilities. "A logbook? Did you hear anything specific about what's in it?" "Not really," Lucas admitted, shoulders slumping as if disappointed in himself. "Just that it needed to be kept safe. But—" He paused, gathering his thoughts, fingers drumming quietly against his knee. The way he talked about it, like it was dangerous if anyone found it, like it could ruin everything. "That could be exactly what we need," Raphael encouraged, hope rising in his chest. "Tell me more about your case, Lucas. About what happened with your brother." Lucas's voice grew stronger as he spoke, finding strength in the telling. "My brother Mario. He runs a small grocery store on Maple Street. Keller started coming around, demanding protection money. When Mario refused..." Lucas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. 2 days later they arrested me, said they found drugs in my car. But I've never touched drugs, I swear. I don't even drink." "I believe you," Raphael said firmly, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "Your story fits the pattern. Targeting families, using false charges as leverage. It's how bullies operate." Lucas looked up, newfound determination shining in his dark eyes. "If you think we can stop him, I'll do whatever I can. I don't want anyone else's family going through this." Raphael placed a steady hand on Lucas's shoulder, feeling the young man's trembling subside at the touch. "We will," he replied with quiet conviction. "Together. And when we're done, you'll be free to go home to your family." The morning sunlight filtered through the narrow cell window, casting long shadows across Raphael's thoughtful face. Dust motes danced in the golden beam, a stark contrast to the grim surroundings. He sat on the cold bench, his mind working through the pieces of information like a complex puzzle, each detail falling into place with disturbing clarity. "Lucas," he said softly, his voice barely disturbing the heavy prison air. "I think I understand what happened to Markson now." Lucas looked up from where he sat huddled in the corner, his thin shoulders pressed against the rough concrete wall. "What do you mean?" "The logbook you mentioned. It's the key. Markson must have discovered its existence." Raphael's voice was barely above a whisper, his words meant only for Lucas's ears. "Think about it. A detailed record of every bribe, every false arrest, every dropped charge. It would be enough to bring down their entire operation. The kind of evidence that could shatter everything they've built." Lucas's eyes widened with understanding, a flash of fear crossing his young face. "And that's why they..." He couldn't finish the sentence, his hands trembling at the thought. Raphael nodded grimly, his jaw tightening. "Markson tried to report Keller, but the corruption runs deep. He probably realized he needed concrete evidence, something they couldn't ignore or brush aside. He filed a complaint," Lucas recalled, wringing his hands nervously, his knuckles turning white. I heard some officers talking about it in the hallway, but then he just vanished, like he never existed. Because he knew too much, Raphael concluded, leaning forward slightly. Just like... The cell block door crashed open with a metallic bang that echoed through the corridor, cutting off their conversation. Keller stormed in, his face twisted with rage, his uniform pristine but his composure clearly cracking. 2 officers flanked him, their expressions carefully blank. "Search the cell," Keller barked, spittle flying from his mouth. "These 2 are plotting something. I know it." The guards roughly pushed Raphael and Lucas against the wall, patting them down with unnecessary force. They tore through the thin mattresses and checked every corner of the small space, leaving chaos in their wake. "Nothing, sir," one guard reported, straightening his uniform. Keller's face reddened to a dangerous shade, a vein pulsing at his temple. "You think you're clever, don't you, Judge?" He jabbed a finger at Raphael, his hand shaking with barely controlled fury. "Stirring up trouble, asking questions, this isn't your courtroom, you have no power here?" Raphael met his gaze steadily, saying nothing, his silence more powerful than words. He noticed the slight tremor in Keller's hand, the sheen of sweat on his forehead, the wild look in his eyes. The man was unraveling piece by piece. After the guards finished their fruitless search, Keller lingered at the cell door, his presence like a dark cloud. "Watch them closely," he ordered, his voice thick with threat. "No talking, not a word." As Keller's footsteps echoed down the corridor, growing fainter with each step, Raphael turned to Lucas. "Markson tried to fight this," he whispered, determination hardening his features. "And now it's our turn. We just need to stay one step ahead. Keep our wits about us." Lucas nodded, a new determination replacing the fear in his eyes, his youth giving way to something stronger, more resilient. The evening brought a tense atmosphere to the holding cells. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that danced across the walls as Keller stormed into the cell block, his boots echoing against the concrete floor like angry thunderclaps. Raphael watched him carefully from behind the bars, noting how Keller's usual swagger had been replaced by jerky, anxious movements. The officer's hands kept fidgeting with his belt and handcuffs, and his eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal searching for escape. "Check their cells again, every single one," Keller barked at the guards, his voice cracking with barely contained panic. "Every corner, every crack, every loose brick. I want everything turned inside out." Raphael stepped closer to the bars, his posture relaxed but purposeful, a stark contrast to Keller's agitation. He studied Keller's face, the beads of sweat rolling down his forehead, the twitching muscle in his jaw, the way his collar seemed too tight around his neck. This was a man on edge, teetering toward a breaking point, and Raphael knew exactly how to push him there. "Your operation must be crumbling if you're this nervous," Raphael said quietly, his words cutting through the tension like a knife through still water. "I can smell the fear coming off you." Keller whirled around, stalking toward Raphael's cell with predatory intent. His face was flushed with anger, his fingers curled into white-knuckled fists. "Watch your mouth, inmate," he snarled, spittle flying from his lips. "Or what?" Raphael maintained his calm demeanor, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You'll hide behind your badge again? That's what cowards do. Use their power to control others because they're too weak to face the truth about themselves. And you're the biggest coward I've ever met." Keller slammed his hand against the bars with explosive force, making them rattle and ring throughout the cell block. "You think you're so smart? You don't know half of what I've done to keep people like you in line. The things I've covered up, the deals I've made." The sound of hurried footsteps made them both turn. Officer Daniels stood frozen in the doorway, his young face pale as chalk as he took in the scene before him. His hand hovered uncertainly near his radio, and his eyes flickered between Keller and Raphael like a spectator at a dangerous tennis match. Keller's outburst hung in the air like thick smoke, choking the atmosphere. Raphael watched as realization dawned on Keller's face. He'd said too much, revealed too much, especially in front of the wide-eyed Daniels. The senior officer's expression shifted, a cold mask sliding back into place like a steel shutter. "Take him to solitary," Keller ordered, his voice now controlled and icy as winter frost. "He just threatened me. Make sure he learns his lesson about respect." As two guards opened the cell to escort Raphael out, their grip tight on his arms, Keller leaned in close, his breath hot against Raphael's ear. "You'll regret ever crossing me, smart guy. I promise you that." Raphael met his gaze steadily, unflinching. "We'll see who regrets it in the end, Officer Keller. Time has a way of revealing all truths." In the oppressive darkness of solitary confinement, Raphael sat with his back against the cold concrete wall. The single light bulb above cast eerie shadows that danced across the scratched surfaces, desperate messages and tallies carved by previous inmates. The air felt thick and stale, making each breath a conscious effort. The tiny cell seemed to press in around him, a testament to how far Keller would go to silence those who opposed him. Raphael closed his eyes, his father's voice echoing in his mind. "The darkest moments are when you find out what you're truly made of." A small smile crossed his face as he remembered his father's weathered hands and determined expression when sharing wisdom earned through years of hard work. The memory brought warmth to the cold cell, strengthening his spirit. "You were right, Papa," Raphael whispered into the darkness. "This is when it matters most." His words hung in the heavy air, a quiet declaration of defiance. In the quiet isolation, Raphael's mind worked methodically through every piece of information he'd gathered. Markson's disappearance wasn't random. It was a deliberate silencing. The logbook held proof of years of corruption, which explained Keller's increasing paranoia. Each detail clicked into place like puzzle pieces, forming a clearer picture. The pattern of abuse stretched back further than he'd initially suspected. Back in the holding cell, Lucas paced nervously. He wrung his hands, trying to remember any conversations he'd overheard that might help Raphael. The guilt weighed heavily on him. If he hadn't shared information about Markson, would Raphael be safer? But he knew Raphael was right. Someone had to stand up to Keller. His footsteps echoed against the concrete floor as his mind raced through memories, searching for anything useful. Raphael used the isolation to strengthen his resolve. Every person Keller had hurt, every family he'd extorted, every life he'd destroyed, they deserved justice. Lucas deserved justice. Markson deserved justice. The solitude that was meant to break him only made his determination stronger. Each passing minute hardened his commitment to exposing the truth. Hours crawled by until the door finally creaked open. Keller's silhouette filled the doorway, his face lit from below by his flashlight creating menacing shadows. The beam cut through the darkness like a knife, reflecting off the moisture on the walls. "Good news, Judge." Keller's voice dripped with false cheerfulness. "We've got some new evidence in your case. You're being transferred tomorrow morning." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "Special transport, just for you." His smile didn't reach his cold eyes. Raphael kept his expression neutral, but internally his mind raced. The transfer was clearly a cover. Keller and Henley were making their move. They planned to silence him permanently, just as they had silenced others who threatened their operation. As Keller's footsteps faded away, Raphael touched his father's watch, now missing from his wrist, and thought, "If they're moving me, that's my chance." The empty space where the watch had been served as a reminder of everything he was fighting for. The next morning, harsh fluorescent lights flickered as two guards yanked Raphael from his solitary cell. His muscles ached from the cold concrete floor, but he kept his expression neutral. They marched him through the dim corridors back to the main holding area. Through the bars, he caught Lucas's worried gaze. The young man's face was etched with concern, his hands gripping the cell bars until his knuckles turned white. Raphael managed to mouth, "Stay strong," before being pulled away. At the processing desk, Officer Daniels stood with another guard, their voices carrying across the room. "Is this really necessary? He's not violent," Daniels said, shuffling the transfer paperwork with trembling hands. The other guard scoffed. "Just follow orders," he snapped, snatching the papers from Daniels' grip. Raphael watched Daniels carefully while pretending to stare at the floor. The young officer's Adam's apple bobbed nervously every time Keller barked an order. His fingers fidgeted with his uniform buttons, and he kept glancing at Raphael with undisguised guilt in his eyes. Keller stormed into the room, his boots clicking against the linoleum floor. "Double-check those restraints," he commanded, watching as the guards secured heavy shackles around Raphael's wrists and ankles. The metal bit into Raphael's skin, but he remained passive, allowing them to think he'd given up. "Get him ready for transport," Keller ordered, his voice dripping with barely concealed satisfaction. "We don't want any accidents during the trip." As the guards led Raphael toward the van, he caught one final glimpse of Lucas. The young man pressed against his cell bars, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Trust yourself," Raphael whispered as he passed. Lucas gave a slight nod, straightening his shoulders despite his obvious fear. The transport van's doors loomed before him, dark and ominous. 2 officers climbed in after Raphael as he was secured to the bench inside. The doors slammed shut with a metallic clang that echoed through the confined space, sealing him in darkness. Raphael took a deep breath, knowing that whatever happened next would determine not just his fate, but the fate of everyone Keller had ever victimized. The transport van rumbled down the empty country road, its metal interior amplifying every bump and turn. Raphael sat quietly, his handcuffed wrists resting in his lap as he studied the 2 officers. The driver, Officer Martinez, maintained a stone-faced expression, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Beside him, Daniels fidgeted with his collar, stealing nervous glances at Raphael through the rearview mirror. Raphael's chest suddenly heaved with violent coughs. He doubled over, gasping for air between spasms. His face turned red as he wheezed desperately. "Something's wrong with him," Daniels said, his voice tight with worry. The coughing grew worse, Raphael's whole body shaking. "He's faking it," Martinez growled, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Raphael slumped against the wall, his breathing becoming more labored. His eyes rolled back as he slid sideways. "We have to stop," Daniels insisted, panic rising in his voice. "If he dies in here, Captain Henley will have our badges, or worse." Martinez cursed but pulled the van onto the shoulder of the road. Trees loomed on both sides, their branches casting dancing shadows in the late morning light. The back doors swung open. As Martinez reached for Raphael suddenly sprung forward, swinging his shackled hands like a club. The heavy metal caught Martinez in the temple with a sickening crack. The officer crumpled instantly. Daniels fumbled for his weapon, but Raphael was already moving. He threw his weight into Martinez's unconscious body, sending them both tumbling into Daniels. The gun clattered to the ground as Raphael pinned the younger officer against the van. "You're not like them," Raphael said intensely, meeting Daniels's frightened eyes. "I've seen it in your face. You know what they're doing is wrong. Help me stop this." Daniels trembled, his gaze darting between Raphael and his fallen partner. After a long moment, he stepped back, lowering his hands. "Go," he whispered, "before I change my mind." Raphael snatched Martinez's keys and quickly freed himself from the shackles. He grabbed the logbook that had fallen from Martinez's jacket during the struggle, then disappeared into the dense forest. Branches whipped his face as he ran, his ribs screaming in protest from days of sleeping on concrete. But he pushed forward through the pain. Raphael stumbled through the dense woods, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The logbook was clutched tightly against his chest like a lifeline. His suit, once pristine, was now torn and muddy. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye where he'd caught a low-hanging branch in his hurried escape. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and oranges when he finally spotted the small wooden cabin nestled among the trees. Miguel Alvarez's home hadn't changed since Raphael had visited as a child with his father. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and a weather-beaten truck sat in the gravel driveway. Raphael limped to the door and knocked weakly. Miguel, his silver hair wild and his kind eyes alert despite the early hour, opened the door. His weathered face creased with concern at the sight of Raphael's condition. "Dios mío," Miguel whispered, quickly ushering Raphael inside. "What happened to you, hijo?" The cabin's interior was warm and simple, a worn leather couch, wooden furniture, and walls lined with books and maps. Miguel guided Raphael to sit at the kitchen table while he gathered first aid supplies. "I can't tell you everything," Raphael said as Miguel cleaned his wounds with gentle hands. "It's safer that way." Miguel nodded, understanding in his eyes. Your father always said you had his sense of justice. Sometimes that leads to trouble. In the cabin's small bedroom, Raphael finally had a moment alone to examine the logbook. The leather-bound volume was filled with cramped handwriting, dates, names, and amounts, all written in some kind of code. His fingers traced over the entries, mind working to decipher the pattern. Miguel brought him a cup of hot coffee and some clean clothes. I have a satellite phone if you need it, he said quietly. It's secure. I keep it for emergencies in the park. Raphael thanked him, grateful for the old friend's discretion and support. As exhaustion began to overtake him, he lay back on the narrow bed, still holding the logbook close. Through the window, he could see Miguel's figure moving outside, checking the perimeter of the property. The old ranger had positioned himself in a chair on the porch, his trusted rifle across his lap, standing guard like a sentinel protecting his own. The aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling eggs drifted through the cabin as Raphael opened his eyes. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. His body ached from yesterday's escape, but his mind felt sharp and focused. Miguel stood at the old gas stove, humming a familiar Spanish tune. Ah, you're awake, he said, sliding a plate of eggs and toast onto the table. Eat first, then work. Raphael nodded gratefully and took a few bites before pulling out the logbook. Its worn leather cover felt heavy in his hands. Opening it, he began studying the cryptic entries more carefully than he had the night before. Look at this, Raphael muttered, running his finger along a line. They've used standard legal terminology, but completely out of context. He grabbed the pen and paper Miguel offered, jotting down notes as patterns emerged. The entries revealed a web of corruption deeper than he'd imagined. Names of prominent figures appeared repeatedly. Judge Harrison, $50K, consultation fee. Officer Rodriguez, promotion secured after special handling of the Martinez case. Each decoded line painted a darker picture. Miguel peered over his shoulder, pointing at recurring entries. This business name keeps showing up. Vanguard Development. Raphael's eyes widened as he made the connection. Vanguard. That's Peter Vance's company. He scribbled frantically. The mayoral candidate who's been preaching about cleaning up the streets. More connections emerged as they worked. Vance's campaign contributions tied directly to cases Keller had manipulated. Properties seized through falsified charges ended up in Vanguard's portfolio. The corruption didn't stop at the precinct doors. It reached into City Hall, the courts, and the business community. Miguel, Raphael said, pushing back from the table, his coffee long cold. This is bigger than I thought. Keller isn't just a corrupt cop. He's a cog in a machine that's taking over the whole city. Looking at the evidence spread across the table, Raphael's jaw set with determination. This isn't just a precinct problem. It's systemic, and I'm going to bring it down. Raphael's fingers traced over the words Markson's backup for the 10th time that afternoon. The phrase appeared in multiple entries, always followed by a series of numbers that didn't match any obvious pattern. Sunlight filtered through the cabin's dusty windows as he worked, casting a warm glow over the scattered papers covering the kitchen table. This has to mean something, he muttered, rubbing his tired eyes. Markson wouldn't have disappeared without leaving evidence somewhere. Miguel brought him another cup of coffee, the ceramic mug clinking softly against the wooden table. Perhaps it's time to reach out to someone who can help, he suggested gently. Raphael nodded slowly, his hand hovering over Miguel's satellite phone. He thought of Elena Cruz, remembering her unwavering integrity during their years working together. She had always stood firm against corruption, even when it cost her promotions. With a deep breath, he dialed her number. The line crackled with static before her familiar voice answered. Cruz speaking. Elena, it's Rafael Ortiz. I need your help. A pause. Rafael? Everyone's looking for you. There's a warrant. I know, he interrupted. But what they're saying isn't true. I've uncovered something big, Elena. Something that could bring down an entire network of corruption. Miguel moved quietly around the cabin, checking windows and securing doors as Raphael spoke. His weathered hands gripped his old hunting rifle, ready to defend his friend if needed. Elena's voice lowered. If you're calling me, it must be bad. Stay low, I'll come to you. After sharing the cabin's location, Rafael hung up and turned to Miguel, who was already stacking furniture against the back door. Miguel, you don't have to… Don't even try, Rafael. Miguel cut him off. Your father was my brother in all but blood. I'm not leaving you to face this alone. Rafael watched as his old friend methodically prepared the cabin for potential threats, his heart heavy with gratitude and concern. He needed to find a way to protect Miguel while pursuing the truth about Markson's evidence. As night fell, Rafael positioned himself by the window, scanning the darkness beyond. The logbook sat heavy in his lap, its secrets slowly unraveling. If Markson left anything behind, he whispered to himself, it might be the leverage we need. The crunch of leaves outside the cabin made Miguel reach for his old hunting rifle, but Rafael held up a hand. That'll be Elena, he whispered, recognizing the deliberate pattern of footsteps they had agreed upon over the phone. Miguel opened the door cautiously, revealing Elena's silhouette in the darkness. She slipped inside quickly, her dark jacket helping her blend with the shadows. The moment she saw Rafael, she rushed forward and wrapped him in a tight embrace. Thank God you're alive, she breathed, pulling back to examine his bruised face. When I heard about your arrest, I knew something was wrong. Rafael led her to the kitchen table where the logbook lay open, surrounded by his notes. It's worse than we thought, Elena. Much worse. He walked her through everything. Keller's operation, Lucas's story, the coded entries that implicated Peter Vance and other powerful figures. Elena listened intently, her experienced detective's eyes scanning the documents. When Rafael finished, she sat back heavily in her chair. This matches what Markson was investigating before he disappeared, she said quietly. He came to me, about 2 months before he vanished. Rafael leaned forward. What did he tell you? He had evidence, real evidence of systematic corruption, not just bribes and false arrests, but money laundering, political kickbacks, even connections to organized crime. Elena's voice was tight with anger. He said he needed time to organize everything properly before going public. And then he disappeared, Rafael finished. Elena nodded. But here's what Keller doesn't know. Markson wasn't stupid. He rented a storage unit under his mother's maiden name 3 weeks before he vanished. Never told anyone except me. Rafael's heart raced. You think that's where he kept his evidence? Has to be. The numbers in your logbook? They could be coordinates or a unit number. Elena glanced toward the window. But we'll have to be careful, if Keller's people are watching the unit. It's worth the risk, Rafael insisted, his father's watch heavy on his wrist. This might be our only shot at exposing everything. They spent the next hour planning their approach to the storage facility, Miguel keeping watch by the window. The fire crackled in the hearth as they worked, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Tomorrow then, Elena said finally, studying the rough map they'd drawn. Rafael nodded, watching the flames. This might be our only chance to get ahead of Keller. Then we make it count, Elena replied firmly, her determination matching his own. Elena's car glided silently through the pre-dawn darkness, its headlights off as they approached the storage facility. Rafael sat in the passenger seat, his father's watch ticking steadily against his wrist, grounding him in the moment. You sure about this? Miguel had asked as they prepared to leave, his weathered hands gripping the first aid kit tightly. His eyes showed the same protective concern Rafael remembered seeing in his own father's face. We have to try, Rafael had replied, accepting the hunting knife Miguel pressed into his hands. The old ranger had nodded, understanding written across his features. Now, parked 3 blocks from their target, Rafael and Elena observed the storage facility through binoculars. The orange security lights cast long shadows between the rows of metal units. A police cruiser sat near the entrance, its occupant visible through the windshield. There's our welcoming committee, Elena muttered, lowering the binoculars. Just like we thought, Keller's got eyes on the place. Rafael studied the facility's layout, noting the side gate partially hidden by overgrown bushes. How sure are you about that unit number? I pulled it from Markson's old case files myself, Elena replied, checking her watch. Unit 247. The key should work, assuming they haven't changed the locks. They reviewed their plan one final time. Elena would approach the patrol car, playing the role of a lost tourist looking for directions. Meanwhile, Raphael would use the distraction to slip through the side entrance. Ready? Elena asked, adjusting her jacket to look more casual. Raphael nodded, his heart pounding but his mind clear. They exited the car separately, Elena walking confidently toward the main entrance while Raphael moved through the shadows toward the side gate. He watched as Elena approached the patrol car, her body language completely transformed into that of a confused traveler. Even from this distance, he could hear her deliberately loud voice asking about a non-existent address. The moment the officer stepped out of his car to assist Elena, Raphael made his move. The side gate's lock had been picked clean by Elena earlier that day, and it opened silently under his touch. He slipped inside, keeping low and moving quickly between the storage units. The numbers guided him. 241, 243, 245. There. Unit 247 loomed before him, identical to its neighbors except for what might lie behind its metal door. Raphael withdrew the key Elena had brought, his hand steady despite the stakes. The lock clicked open cleanly and Raphael paused, taking a deep breath. He grasped the handle and lifted the door, revealing the darkness within. Raphael stepped into the musty storage unit, his heart pounding against his ribs. The beam from his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing stacks of cardboard boxes and a metal folding table. A thin layer of dust covered everything, undisturbed for years. On the table sat an old laptop and a small voice recorder, waiting like silent witnesses. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the voice recorder. The weight of it felt heavy with secrets. He pressed play, and Markson's voice filled the small space, tired but determined. If you're hearing this, I didn't make it out, but this evidence can bring them down. Raphael moved quickly through the boxes, discovering meticulously organized files. Financial records showed payments to phantom accounts. Witness statements detailed Keller's intimidation tactics. Each document painted a clearer picture of the corruption that had claimed Markson's life. His phone buzzed, a text from Elena. Officer getting suspicious, hurry. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he photographed the most damning evidence. His fingers moved swiftly across documents, his phone's camera clicking rapidly. Time seemed to compress around him, each second precious. Then he spotted it, a box labeled logbook matches tucked beneath the table. Inside, Markson had compiled evidence linking Keller's coded entries to specific crimes and payoffs. The connection was clear. Markson had already done the work of decoding the very logbook Raphael had stolen. He gathered the most crucial items, including the voice recorder and key documents. His heart raced as he carefully closed the unit, erasing any signs of his presence. He met Elena at their predetermined spot behind an abandoned gas station. As they pulled onto the street, Elena's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "We've been made," she said, watching the patrol car's headlights appear in the rearview mirror. Raphael's knuckles turned white as he gripped the evidence box, his body tensing with each sharp turn Elena took through the narrow streets. The patrol car's flashing lights painted the buildings around them in alternating red and blue, growing closer with each passing moment. "They're calling for backup," Raphael warned, watching through the rear window as the officer grabbed his radio. The sound of sirens filled the air, echoing off the buildings. Elena's face remained focused, her hand steady on the wheel as she navigated another sharp turn. "I know these streets better than they do," she said, her voice calm despite the tension. The car's tires screeched as she took another corner, momentarily putting some distance between them and their pursuers. Through the side mirror, Raphael spotted two more patrol cars joining the chase. Elena pressed harder on the accelerator, heading toward the outskirts of town, where the streets gave way to dense forest. The evidence box slid across the back seat as she swerved to avoid a roadblock. "Hold on!" Elena shouted as she yanked the wheel hard, taking them off the main road onto a narrow gravel path. The car bounced violently, the undercarriage scraping against rocks and dirt. Tree branches whipped against the windows as they pushed deeper into the wooded area. When they reached a small clearing, Elena slammed on the brakes. "We need to move now," she commanded, grabbing her backpack. Raphael clutched the box of evidence to his chest as they abandoned the car, plunging into the thick underbrush. Behind them, flashlight beams cut through the darkness as officers spread out through the woods. Raphael and Elena crouched low, moving carefully to avoid making noise. Their breathing came in short, controlled bursts as they pushed deeper into the forest. Finally, hidden beneath a thick canopy of leaves, they paused to catch their breath. The flashlight still swept through the trees, but the dense foliage provided cover from searching eyes. "We need to get this to someone who can help," Raphael whispered, his arms still wrapped protectively around the box. Elena nodded in the darkness. "We'll figure it out," she replied softly. "But first, we need to survive the night." The first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees as Raphael and Elena stumbled out of the forest. Their clothes were dirty and torn, faces scratched from branches, but their determination remained unshaken. Elena led the way to a small roadside diner, its neon open sign flickering in the early morning light. "Carla's worked here for 20 years, Elena whispered as they approached the back door. "She'll help us." The door creaked open, revealing a short woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes. "Elena, what happened to you two?" "We need your help, Carla. That favor you owe me? I'm calling it in." Carla ushered them inside without hesitation, leading them to a small storage room converted into an office. "Take as long as you need. Nobody will bother you here." Raphael's hands trembled as he connected to Carla's Wi-Fi, using her old desktop computer to contact Maria. His loyal clerk answered on the first ring. "Judge Ortiz, are you okay? Everyone's looking for you." "Maria, listen carefully," Raphael said, his voice low and urgent. "I'm sending you evidence of corruption in Keller's precinct. It goes deeper than we thought, all the way to Peter Vance's campaign. I need you to get this to the FBI immediately." While Raphael explained everything to Maria, Elena kept watch through a small window, monitoring the street outside. A news report on the diner's TV caught her attention. Raphael's photo appeared on screen, labeled as a dangerous fugitive who had assaulted an officer during his escape. "They're painting you as a criminal," Elena muttered, shaking her head in disgust. "Raphael," Maria's voice crackled through the speaker. "I'll make sure this reaches the right people at the FBI, but you need to stay hidden. Keller's desperate. He'll do anything to stop you now." "I understand. Be careful, Maria." As Raphael ended the call, he turned to Elena. His expression was grim but determined. "The evidence is in safe hands, but we're not out of this yet. Keller won't stop until he's sure I'm gone." Elena's jaw set firmly as she replied, "Then we fight harder." In the dimly lit safe house, Raphael paced the creaky wooden floor while Elena watched him from a worn armchair. The small room smelled of old coffee and dust, with newspapers covering the windows to prevent anyone from seeing inside. Their temporary refuge, arranged by Carla, was a forgotten apartment above an abandoned storefront. "We can't keep running forever," Raphael said, his voice firm but tired. "Keller won't stop until he thinks he's won." Elena shook her head, concern etched on her face. "You're talking about confronting him directly. That's suicide, Raphael. He's already tried to kill you once." Raphael stopped pacing and leaned against the wall. "His arrogance is his weakness. He thinks he's above the law, untouchable. That's exactly why we can trap him." "How?" Elena asked, leaning forward. "We make him think he's winning," Raphael explained, pulling out a burner phone from his jacket pocket. "I'll offer to surrender. Tell him I'll trade the evidence for my safety." Elena stood up, her eyes wide. "He'll never believe that." "He will," Raphael said with certainty. "Because his ego won't let him think otherwise. He needs those documents back and he'll convince himself I'm desperate enough to deal." Raphael dialed Keller's number, his fingers steady despite the stakes. The line rang twice before Keller's gruff voice answered. "I want to make a deal," Raphael said calmly. "Just you and me, no backup. I'll bring everything. The logbook, Markson's evidence, all of it." Keller's voice dripped with smugness. "Finally showing some sense, Judge." They arranged to meet at an abandoned factory outside town. While Raphael talked, Elena set up their surveillance equipment, microphones, recording devices, and a wire for Raphael to wear. "This has to work," Elena said as she helped Raphael with the wire. "If it doesn't..." Raphael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It will. We just need him to incriminate himself on record." As Raphael prepared to leave, checking the wire one final time, Elena grabbed his arm. "Be careful," she said softly. "If anything goes wrong, I'll be close by." Raphael nodded, his expression resolute as he headed for the door. The abandoned factory loomed like a steel giant against the darkening sky, its broken windows reflecting the last rays of sunlight. Raphael stood in the shadows of the loading dock, his heart steady despite the wire concealed beneath his shirt. The musty air carried the sharp tang of rust and old motor oil, reminding him of his father's days working in places like this. Footsteps echoed through the empty building as Keller appeared, his police badge gleaming dully on his belt. His hand rested casually on his holstered weapon, and that familiar smug smile played across his face. He circled Raphael slowly like a shark sizing up its prey. "Where's the evidence?" Keller demanded, his voice bouncing off the metal walls. Raphael stood his ground, shoulders squared. "You've already lost, Keller. The truth will come out with or without me." Keller's smile twisted into a snarl. "Lost? Do you have any idea how long I've been running things? How many people I've dealt with who thought they could stop me?" "Like Markson?" Raphael prodded. "Markson was weak." Keller spat, pacing faster now. "He thought he could expose us, but I showed him what happens to people who don't know their place. Just like those families who couldn't pay up. They learned quick enough." Keller's voice rose with each boast. "You think planting evidence is hard? Getting confessions? Please. I've got half the precinct in my pocket and the other half too scared to talk. Even got the DA looking the other way. Amazing what a few well-placed bribes can do." As Keller ranted, Raphael subtly touched his wrist, the signal to Elena, who monitored everything from her position nearby. Through her earpiece, she quickly relayed to the FBI agents, "We've got it. Move in." "I own this town," Keller continued, his face flushed with anger. "And no self-righteous judge is going to..." The distant wail of sirens cut through the air. Keller froze mid-sentence, his eyes widening as realization dawned. His gaze dropped to Raphael's chest, finally noticing the slight bulge of the wire beneath his shirt. The color drained from Keller's face as the sirens grew louder. Raphael took a step back, watching as the officer's arrogant facade crumbled into disbelief. The sharp crack of gunfire echoed through the factory as Keller, his face contorted with panic, fired wildly at Raphael. The bullet whizzed past, embedding itself in a rusted metal beam. Raphael dove behind a stack of old crates, his heart pounding but his mind clear. "It's over, Keller," Raphael shouted, his voice steady and strong. "You can't run from this." Heavy boots thundered across the concrete floor as FBI agents flooded into the building, their weapons drawn. Keller spun around, realizing he was surrounded. His gun trembled in his hand as the agents closed in. "Drop your weapon," an agent commanded. "Get on the ground now." For a moment, Keller looked like he might try to shoot his way out. Then reality seemed to sink in. His gun clattered to the floor and the agents rushed forward, tackling him. They quickly secured his hands behind his back with handcuffs. "You don't understand," Keller screamed, thrashing against the restraints. "I have friends. Powerful friends. They'll never let this stick." Raphael emerged from behind the crates, brushing dust from his clothes. He approached Keller, who was now kneeling on the ground, surrounded by agents. Their eyes met, and Raphael saw the fear behind Keller's bravado. "Your power is gone," Raphael said quietly, his words carrying clearly in the tense silence. "Justice isn't for sale anymore." Keller's face twisted with rage, but his threats had lost their sting. Two agents hauled him to his feet and began leading him toward the exit. Raphael watched as they escorted Keller away, feeling the weight of the past few days lifting from his shoulders. The factory grew quiet except for the fading sound of footsteps and radio chatter. As Keller disappeared through the doorway, Raphael took a deep breath. The fight had been long and dangerous, but this victory marked an important step toward true justice. The FBI's investigation moved swiftly after Keller's arrest. Teams of agents descended on the precinct, armed with search warrants and evidence boxes. The scene was electric with tension, as officers watched their colleagues being questioned and escorted out in handcuffs. The logbook's cryptic entries, now fully decoded, led investigators through a complex web of corruption that stretched far beyond the station's walls. Maria proved invaluable during the process, her meticulous attention to detail helping agents trace financial transactions and connect key players. She spent hours in conference rooms, explaining the patterns she'd noticed over the years and providing context to suspicious court proceedings. Her hands trembled slightly as she handled documents, but her voice remained steady and clear. I always knew something wasn't right, she told the investigators, but Raphael gave us the chance to prove it. The evidence painted a damning picture. Local business leaders had paid bribes to avoid inspections. Politicians had arranged for charges to disappear against their supporters. Even the mayoral candidate, Peter Vance, was implicated in a scheme to manipulate crime statistics for his campaign. Raphael watched from the sidelines as the dominoes began to fall. Each day brought new revelations and resignations. The local news ran constant coverage of the scandal, featuring interviews with victims of the corruption, including Lucas and his family. The public's anger grew with each new detail. At FBI headquarters, Raphael sat in a stark interview room, recounting his ordeal. The agents listened intently, taking detailed notes as he described Keller's threats, the discovery of the logbook, and the final confrontation at the factory. "You took an enormous risk," one agent said, shaking his head in admiration. "Most people would have looked the other way." "My father taught me that justice is worth fighting for," Raphael replied simply. Outside the FBI building, a small crowd had gathered. Some held signs thanking Raphael for his courage. Others were families who had suffered under Keller's regime, their faces showing relief and vindication. Raphael paused at the top of the steps, taking in the scene before him. The weight of the past week still pressed on his shoulders, but there was lightness too, the feeling of truth finally breaking free. Looking out at the supportive faces, Raphael felt the profound impact of what they'd accomplished. This wasn't just about taking down one corrupt officer. It was about restoring faith in the system itself. This is what justice should feel like, he thought, allowing himself a moment to appreciate the victory. Raphael stood in the polished hallway of the FBI headquarters, his testimony complete but his mind still focused on unfinished business. "What about Lucas Ramirez?" he asked Agent Thompson, who was gathering the last of his paperwork. "The young man from the holding cell?" The agent tapped his tablet, scanning through files. "Ah, yes, Mr. Ramirez. His case has been flagged for immediate review given the circumstances. All charges are being dropped." He looked up at Raphael. "Would you like me to handle his release?" "No," Raphael said firmly. "I need to do this myself." I made him a promise. At the precinct, the atmosphere was markedly different from when Raphael had last been there. FBI agents occupied the spaces where corrupt officers once strutted, and the air felt lighter somehow. Raphael waited in the processing area, his heart beating faster when he saw Lucas being let out. Lucas stopped short when he saw Raphael, his eyes widening in disbelief. Then his composure crumbled, tears streaming down his face. "You didn't forget about me," he managed to say between sobs. Raphael stepped forward, placing both hands on Lucas's shoulders. "You helped me as much as I helped you. Never let anyone take away your voice again." Lucas wiped his eyes with his sleeve. "I'm scared," he admitted. "My family lost so much because of Keller. Our savings, my brother's job." His voice trailed off. "Listen to me," Raphael said gently. "I know some people who can help. Legal aid, job placement programs, counseling if you need it. You're not alone in this." A woman's cry interrupted them. "Lucas!" It was his mother, rushing forward to embrace her son. She turned to Raphael, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for bringing him back to me." Lucas gave Raphael one final, fierce hug before joining his mother. Raphael watched them walk away together, feeling the weight of the past few days finally beginning to lift. The sight of Lucas, free and reunited with his family, represented everything he had fought for. The gravel crunched under Raphael's tires as he pulled up to Miguel's cabin. The familiar sight of smoke curling from the chimney brought a smile to his face. The woods around him were peaceful, the rustling leaves a welcome change from sirens and chaos. Miguel stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "So, the troublemaker returns," he said with a warm grin. "Some things never change," Raphael replied, climbing the worn wooden steps. Inside, the cabin smelled of coffee and wood smoke. Miguel poured them each a cup, settling into his favorite armchair. "Your father would be proud, you know, taking on corruption just like he always taught you." "I couldn't have done it without your help," Raphael said, his voice thick with gratitude. Miguel waved off the thanks. "You Ortiz men always find your way into trouble. Someone's got to watch your back." He chuckled. "Though I have to admit, this was more excitement than I bargained for in retirement." In the small bedroom where he'd sought refuge, Raphael packed his few belongings. His father's watch lay on the nightstand, its familiar weight a comfort as he picked it up. Opening the case, he traced the inscription his father had added years ago: "Justice comes to those who stand." The past weeks played through his mind like a movie. The arrest, meeting Lucas, discovering Keller's corruption, the dangerous escape, and finally, justice being served. The network was dismantled, with arrests still ongoing as more evidence came to light. Lucas was free, rebuilding his life with a fresh start. Raphael knew there would be more battles ahead. Corruption didn't disappear overnight. But for now, he felt at peace with what they'd accomplished. Stepping onto the cabin porch one last time, Raphael breathed in deeply. The forest air filled his lungs, clean and crisp. Looking at the winding path ahead, he smiled. Raphael adjusted his robes as he entered his courtroom, the familiar weight settling on his shoulders like a welcome embrace. The gallery was packed, and the morning light streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. "All rise," the bailiff called out, the Honorable Judge Raphael Ortiz presiding. Maria stood at his desk, organizing case files with practiced efficiency. She leaned in as he approached. "Welcome back, Your Honor. The FBI's investigation has expanded to include 3 more city officials. They're questioning everyone connected to Keller's operation." Raphael nodded, taking his seat at the bench. The case before him today involved an officer accused of using excessive force during an arrest. As testimony unfolded, Raphael listened intently, his recent experiences lending new depth to his understanding. When it came time for his ruling, Raphael's voice carried clear and steady through the courtroom. "The badge is not a shield from accountability," he declared. "It is a symbol of public trust, one that must be earned and maintained through ethical conduct." During the afternoon recess, Maria knocked on his chamber door. "Someone's here to see you, Your Honor." Lucas entered, standing taller than Raphael remembered. Gone was the frightened young man from the holding cell. In his place stood someone with hope in his eyes. "I got a job at the community center," Lucas said proudly, "working with kids, helping them stay on the right path." His voice softened. "I wouldn't be here without you, Judge Ortiz. You showed me that one person really can make a difference." Raphael smiled warmly. "You did the hard part, Lucas. You chose to be brave when it mattered most." "I want to help others like you helped me," Lucas said. "Maybe go back to school, study law someday." "You have that strength inside you," Raphael assured him. "Keep moving forward, one step at a time." As the day drew to a close, Raphael walked down the courthouse steps. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. He pulled out his father's watch, its familiar weight comforting in his palm. "We did it, Dad," he whispered, his words carried away by the evening breeze. Standing there, looking out over the city he'd sworn to serve, Raphael felt a deep sense of peace. The watch ticked steadily in his hand, marking each moment of a justice system slowly turning toward truth. If you enjoyed the story of Raphael, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.